Okay, so we are little by little, people are joining us today. So I'm going to go a couple of more minutes while they join. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As you know, today we are going to be talking about how to publish in economics, but actually on education more in general. I'm going to be the chair of this session today, and today we'll have KimMarie, McGoldrick from the University of Richmond, Stephen Proud from Bristol, and McIntyre from Lancaster University. However, we have our speakers with their hats as editors or co-editors of different journals. And in particular, we have KimMarie, who is a co-editor of the Journal of Economic Education. And she's also the chair of the American Economic Association Committee on Economic Education. And we have McIntyre, who is a professor of education and is co-editor of assessments and evaluation in higher education. And we have Stephen Proud, who's a reader in economics education at Bristol and co-editor for the International Review of Economics Education. So just a reminder, everybody, that the session is recorded and we are live streaming from a YouTube channel. So welcome to the YouTube, to people listening and following us from YouTube. And also a reminder to all our attendees, whether on YouTube or whether on Zoom, that you can ask your questions, use the chat. We are really happy to have lively chats. And we are going to have Claudia today, who is gonna be checking the chat and sending your questions to me. So please make use either on YouTube or on Zoom. Sorry, I'm used to Teams, so I keep getting lost. Thank you, everybody. On the screen, we have some of the main aims and scopes of the different journals here as taken from their website. So we can see that from the Journal of Economic Education, it offers original articles on teaching economics. It has pages on leading scholars that evaluate innovations, teaching techniques, material, and programs. We have from the assessments and evaluation in higher education. This is not and specialized on economics education, but this is an education journal and focus on assessments and evaluation in higher education is aimed to, in fact, all higher education practitioners, irrespective of the discipline, and aims to provide accessible, up-to-date information about significant developments within the field. We also have the International Review of Economics Education, who again is focused more on economics education and published on research in areas of curriculum design, pedagogy, assessment, teaching, and learning innovation. I'm just looking through the list of participants today. I can see a lot of you are being for a long time either interested or working on economics education. And I would say that this is, for some of us, a sort of new thing, because in the UK, at least, we have seen a recent development, at least in economics, of this education track within next to the kind of teaching or research track. So there are people that are more focused on education. And there has been a lot of discussion on scholarship and kind of how we can contribute in our roles of educators to the scholarship in our discipline, which for some of us is a bit difficult because we come from a very specific background on economics. We did our studies in economics, PhDs in economics, and research in economics. So kind of transitioning through this kind of analysis of economic education and engaging with pedagogical techniques and with kind of sharing this practice, because a lot of us are doing, and I'm pretty sure I've seen a lot of your work doing very good practice in education, but then becomes very difficult on how we share this. How can we make this, convert this into research, into published papers? And I think this is kind of the type of conversation we want to have today with our speakers. So let me stop sharing so I can make it a little bit easier. And let me just invite our speakers to tell us a little bit more about, in your roles as editors, what are you looking in good papers that are published in your journals? And why should researchers here, listening later, should consider to publish in these journals? And if you have any recommendations for authors, and perhaps some typical rejection reasons. So I have a few questions for all of you. And let's start with KimMarie.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a couple of points that are much easier to make with slides because there's a lot of information. As she said, I am co-editor with Sam Allgood, and our journal is perhaps a bit unique in the education realm because we do have a number of sections within the journals, and each section has a different goal. So I'm going to go through each of those sections, and I want to highlight what we're looking for in those sections. And please note at the bottom of each screen, because I know there's a lot of information here, at the bottom of each screen is an article published specific to that section of the journal to give advice about what we are looking for, some of the pitfalls of articles that get rejected, etc. So I ask you to look at those articles for additional information. So I'll just give a highlight here. So the first section is the research section. This is original theoretical and empirical pieces, and it can cover a wide range of topics of teaching methods, learning attitudes, material effectiveness, or pedagogical processes. Each of them starts, or our advice is to start with theory, ground your work in theory. Why is it that you think the intervention would actually have an outcome that is positive for learning? Planning before you start is really critical. Reflection that says, oh, this was a really great idea. It seemed to work. Now, how do I show that it did? Is not effective for necessarily publishing in this section of the journal, because the proper construction of a hypothesis, the research design, the treatment effect, random assignment, all of these are really critical components that can't happen in hindsight. And the Committee on Econ Ed has a page on their website that has an econometric tutorial that can help for those who might not be familiar with some of the econometric methods that are used in Econ Ed. Another section that it is about content. It's not about whether students learn more or less, but it's taking the content, the cutting edge work that's happening in our discipline and translating it to something that can be taught at the undergraduate or graduate levels. This could also include historical studies of what have we changed in our teaching over time. Textbooks that have mistakes. So for instance, in the introductory macroeconomic textbooks in the US, they're still teaching macro policy that no longer exists. We also invite comparisons of textbooks on major issues. How much do they incorporate those issues, and how do they do so? So that would be our content section. Our instructional section, this is the section where we encourage people that have done pedagogical innovations, but maybe only have anecdotal evidence to consider sharing their work. So you might think of this as, in a sense, a preliminary to a standardized research project where you're describing, you're showing innovative materials, you're explaining how you use data sources in your classroom, how you use technology. But again, your evidence of effectiveness tends to be more anecdotal. We also have a section loosely defined, because these experimental papers can show up throughout the journal, but given the cutting edge of experimental work these days, we also have a paper that describes what are some of the things we're looking at in experimental papers. And that can be either new experiments, For instance, Charlie Holt has published in the Journal of EconEd showing new experiments that he's developed that can be used at the undergraduate and graduate level, or testing the efficacy of either an existing experiment or an experiment that has been modified, extended. And then we have a features and information session. This is, in a sense, our section of the journal that gives back to the profession so that we can understand the landscape of educational trends, assessments, different curriculum and programs. For instance, in the US right now, there's a big push to move economic majors to STEM majors so that our international students have the ability to stay, for instance, a 5th year. Their STEM designation is important for some of our students. What has been happening in that realm would show up in our features in information section. And then our final section is an online section. This is not a traditional paper. This is a one-page paper that describes materials that are provided online, because these materials don't lend themselves to the print copy. So these could be simulations, computer tools, different media that is used, etc. So that's a completely different kind of sharing of pedagogic practices that have these components in their design. So I'll leave it at that and hope that there'll be some questions in the chat more specific, but I just wanted to give you an overview of why our journal is unique because of the sections that we support.
Thank you very much, KimMarie. Actually, very useful, and things that I didn't know even after looking at the journal. And in fact, yeah, Claude, I agree, didn't realize it was such a mix of papers. But we have some questions, but let's go first to Steve, and I'll go through all the panelists, and then we get some questions. So Steve, do you want to tell us a little bit about ERIE?
Yeah, so ERIE has quite an overlap with the aims and the purposes of the Journal of Economics Education, in that we are trying to capture teaching innovations, innovations in terms of pedagogy and curriculum, and also reviews of the literature relating to pedagogy. In particular, we are conscious that it's not always possible to pre-design and have a good randomization when it comes to teaching innovation, simply because in UK universities we do have quite a few issues getting traction through ethics committees to approve randomizations. So what we look for if we're seeing new pedagogies being discussed is some form of evaluation. Now, the evaluation may be a quantitative evaluation. It may be looking, is there an identification strategy that can be used here in order to draw out the impact of the innovation on the students' outcomes. But also, we are interested in more qualitative evaluations of pedagogies as well. One thing I would add over and above what KimMarie spoke about is that something that is really important within the economics education literature is that we don't find ourselves in silos. We aren't. We're going to hear from Malcolm in a few minutes, but it's important to think about the fact that we aren't just developing a new pedagogy ourselves. We're not just thinking about curricula in isolation. We're not just thinking about assessment in isolation. We're thinking about how we connect to the rest of the education literature, and it's really important that we draw together those strands. And in a way, that is sometimes a weakness that we see with papers that are submitted, that sometimes we as economists do get stuck in our own economic silo, and we don't necessarily read as widely as, or some of us don't always read as widely as we should do, I should say. I know I'm guilty of this, of starting in the economic literature and then discovering that what we're proposing has been done 10 years, 15 years, 20 years before in physics or in some other discipline. So that's something that is really important when we're thinking about what would make a good article. is it grounded not just in the economics literature? Is it also grounded in the education literature more widely? Just as a bit of background about myself, because I think this is always useful to think about just in terms of what might make a good article. So I came from a background of research in economics, in the economics of education. So I was evaluating teaching innovations in high schools. And sometimes we do get articles which are seeing International Review of Economics Education. That must be the economics of education. And we see an awful lot of articles that get submitted which aren't really in the scope. So the number one thing to try and ensure you get published is think, well, is this really an economics education? Is this the education of economics that we're looking at? Is there some evaluation of pedagogy? Is there some development of curriculum? That's the sort of thing that we're looking for in the journal. If, however, and I do see quite a few articles like this, if, however, it's a more of an economics of education, so how do school children learn maths, that's not going to be of as much interest to our general readership.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now, let's go to Malcolm. And Malcolm, if you can also tell us a little bit of your background, because of course now you're editor of the Assessments and Feedback Journal, Assessment and Evaluation Journal, sorry, but you have been editor in education. And I guess here you have, I think I'm looking around, most of us are economists. And so for us might feel a bit like, oh my gosh, publishing in education is a completely different thing and a completely different jump. So you can tell us a little bit more about that. That would be great.
Okay, apologies for background noise, but we've got the builders in. You might hear them tapping away behind me. Yeah, I'm editor of Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, and I've been doing that for 10 years. Before that, I edited another higher education journal, Studies in Higher Education, which I did for about 15 years. Basically, all my career, I've been editing higher education journals. It's a kind of obsession on my part. Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education is a very focused journal. We publish articles on assessment or evaluation in higher education, nothing else, which is a mistake people quite often seem to make when they send us stuff. We're also a highly selective journal. We get at the moment about 800 new submissions a year, and we can publish about 80. So you can work the odds out yourself overall. So clearly what we're looking for is the best articles on assessment or evaluation in higher education. They can be in any discipline, any subject area, or they can be across comparatively a number of subject areas. They can be qualitative or quantitative in their methodology, or they can use a mixture of methods. We're open to pretty much anything in that way.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. So I have a few questions and, okay. Sorry, I'm just reading through the questions and so some very simple ones. And one is, how long does it take to get a paper from submission to final publication? How long does it take, and whether you need to pay to publish in your respective paper journals? Well, let's start with that one. That's very quick.
I'll go ahead and start. There is no payment necessary for submission or publication in our journal. You typically receive a first response after submission within 6 months. Then the review process can take another 6 months. We typically try to have accepted works published once they're recommended for acceptance within 6 months after that period. So it could be 1.5 to 2 years before you see your work in print.
Thank you, Steve.
So similarly, we don't currently have submission fees. The market is changing so quickly that that could change, but I'm not privy to any discussions about that at present. In terms of this, the time that it takes to get a submission from initial submission to publication really does depend on the initial quality of the submission. So we normally have a first decision within around about 3 months. Sometimes it does take longer than that, simply because there are some niche areas that are submitted which are difficult to get reviewers, and that's particularly been growing over the last year and a half. But we'd have a first decision within around about 3 months. If there's a revision, then it would be roughly a 6-week revision period, and then we then make a decision: has that paper reached publication status, or do we need to send it out for another set of reviews? Normally we would see papers in print within a year of them being submitted, quite often a lot quicker.
Okay, same story on fees, no fees, but I think we're a bit quicker in terms of dealing with articles. I aim to decide whether to send something out for review within a week. So if you're going to get rejected, a lot of people get rejected almost immediately. Articles that go out for review, I aim to get an initial decision to the authors within 6 weeks of them going out for review. So that's less than 2 months. And then it's a matter of, if we're going to proceed with it, how big are the revisions required, and how long do the authors take over them? It's over to them in terms of how long it takes. But this does mean, I mean, I've noticed a couple of examples recently where things went through very quickly, and it is possible to get an article accepted within a month, you know, and off to the publishers for formatting and so on and so forth. I mean, clearly, because there's quite a backlog, you won't get into print for another year, 18 months, but you'll be published online a lot quicker than that.
Thank you, Malcolm. I guess that's been the differences between economics. We're used to longer time is taken for publishing than other disciplines. And so we have like a few questions on acceptance, rejection. Something that comes up very often, and I think is about how to collect evidence of impact in education. And I think this is related to what Steve was saying before, and this was a question who came in. So for instance, in the UK, things that we cannot do is, for ethical reasons, we are not allowed to carry out trials on students. So for instance, to say with this group, I do this, and with this group, I do something different, we use, like, it's very difficult to get ethical approval for that. We are almost not, it's not possible. But more in general, like what type of evidence? Because sometimes to see that a change in teaching innovation has actually had an effect might pass years, or might not be able to see because it's something that for employability and these kind of things. And this becomes one of the key questions for many people that say, how is that? How I can prove that my intervention or the changes that I did has effect, and how can I publish that? So I don't know whether, Malcolm, you want to start from the education perspective and then move to Steve and KimMarie.
The typical ways authors go about doing this is either to collect data on student performance and compare it before and after, or, you know, with different groups, or to collect data on student opinions, you know, what they thought about innovation, how they felt it worked for them. The difficulty is, of course, generalizing from that to other classes, other disciplines, other institutions, other countries. And, you know, there's always an issue that if you work on an innovation with your students, they will tend to be fairly well disposed towards it because they can see you're trying to improve things for them. So there's always that background issue of, you know, how transferable might this be?
Thank you, Malcolm. And so answer to that, KimMarie and Steve. And in addition, there is a question from Ramin. If you consider submissions on purely theoretical discussions of pedagogies, let's say possibility of dialogic method in economics and these kind of things. So kind of just join those questions.
Yeah, we certainly do encourage a wide range of perspectives. So theoretical perspectives would be welcome as well.
Thank you. If you have something on evidence as well.
Yeah, so I understand the challenges in the UK of gathering evidence, but we also, like what Malcolm said, appreciate the attitude and the opinion changes of students. It's a different kind of evidence. And if you've done an innovation, you have not done it in the past. So it's not necessarily a treatment and control, which would not pass ethics, but you're doing something that you didn't do in the past. So you can provide reflective evidence on what the history was versus what the current is. This is especially true if you change assessment techniques, because if you add quizzes, for instance, or some other assessment techniques, you can be reflective without violating ethics.
Steve?
Yeah, so again, there's not a huge amount to add in terms of the actual evaluation of an innovation. Very much being able to look at qualitative information in terms of student engagement, being able to observe changes in behavior of students, for instance. So if students are more engaged through, for instance, if you had a digital innovation, if they're more engaged with your teaching material, that can be an evidence of an impact. But there is a wider discussion about what we might mean by impact as well. And I think that it's important to not just think about impact of an innovation on students. And this comes back to one of Malcolm's points, the idea about generalizability and the external validity of the innovation. Because one of the key bits of impact, really, if we've come up with an innovation, is being able to evidence that other institutions, other academics have adopted that as well. It's in standard economics research, it's sometimes relatively easy to measure impact through things like citation metrics, but also if you're being used to shape policy, that can be used as a way of evidencing impact. But this is particularly important when colleagues, particularly teaching track colleagues, are making applications for promotion, to be able to say, well, actually, I've introduced this innovation. It's been adopted by these other institutions on the back of my publication in IRE or in G or in assessment and evaluation. And that is actually going to be a really important metric for more teaching focused academics going forward. In terms of the question about theoretical discussions, absolutely, we welcome any research that fits within the scope of economics education. What I would say is that this always has the general proviso that it needs to be well grounded within the literature, so that it's not just I think this is a really good idea and this is what we should all do.
Thank you very much, Steve. And something that I think a lot of people, especially when you are very new to this job, and we would talk about innovation, and so suddenly you start, well, what do I have to change? What is innovation? How do we define innovation? Because of course, if I am the lecturer or if I am not the module leader, so there is very little that I can do in terms of changing completely a module or these kind of things. Or so perhaps thinking about the younger researchers that perhaps has less power, let's say, in completely change assessment methods or change the modules or change many aspects. And of course, changes take, well, I don't know in the US, but in the UK, usually to change something, we have to think 2 years in advance. We have this year, we propose a change, then it gets approved, and then when we can actually implement the change. But what other things can younger research think about in terms of innovation in teaching, and think in terms of research that can be published? If KimMarie.
I think one thing is just documenting and giving a historical perspective of what actually is the standard. We have some of those papers that have been published in the journal in the US about practices. What are the different pedagogical techniques that are being used? What are the assessment? What are the topics being covered? That would really go a long way to understanding what the landscape is before anyone attempts to shift the landscape. So I think that at different levels of higher education, at intro courses, at higher level courses, would be an amazing paper from any country more broadly.
Great idea. Thank you, KimMarie. Steve?
I mean, I think there is a worry that, well, not a worry, but there's a concern of new researchers who are interested in working in economics education, that they have to come up with a brand new innovation and try it out with their teaching. It might be that young lecturers have some really great ideas and they can implement them straight away, but a really good way into the literature, a really good way into the scholarship of teaching and learning is actually thinking, well, what has gone before? How can we review what's gone on in the past? How can we draw together those ideas to work out, well, what is it that's particularly effective? What is it that's less effective? So systematic reviews of the literature are a really nice way in to being able to think about, well, how can we develop as researchers in economics education? Certainly, we've published quite a number of these reviews in recent years across a range of different focuses in order to try and develop an idea, develop our understanding of what is effective, what is ineffective, and that's certainly a way in that I would strongly recommend.
Yes, I'd agree with that. Certainly systematic reviews, meta-analyses, literature reviews. There's a lot of scope for doing research without actually collecting new data. You know, you don't actually need to do anything. There's so much data out there that people have done already that you can look at, reanalyze, compare, systematize, and so forth. And there's also a huge amount of documentary data, like policy data, you know, institutional, national, international policies of relevance in our case to assessment and evaluation, which can be analyzed textually using content analysis or whatever form of analysis you want to use. So you don't actually have to think in terms of introducing an innovation in a class. There are other models for articles you could adopt.
I think that's why one of the things we have in our journal that features an information section really encourages that. I also want to say that replication is not a bad thing. If a study's been done and it's been done in a particular environment, you don't know if that same thing works in another environment. And if it's gotten approval in the past in one environment, it should get approval in another. So allowing for replication provides a better understanding of the different things of content and instruction, et cetera, that we're trying to enhance. So I would encourage replication.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think a lot of ideas in my head have been like, oh, yeah. So have a few more questions. And of course, something that is very useful, or I found personally very useful, is to attend conference in education, but it's something that I was not aware they almost exist while I was doing my PhD in economics. I was aware of normal conference within economics discipline and stuff. And of course, we have a question about, sorry, I lost it. Yeah, so do you think we should do more to have sort of reading groups for teaching fellows or more junior faculty on pedagogy literature to help them to get their head into the space? But I think I want to link that to kind of, well, I am aware of C3 conference happening at the end of May, June. I'm aware of the conference happening, is also the UK Economics Education Conference happening in September in Edinburgh. But so if you are aware of more kind of sort of reading groups, conferences where people can actually attend and see what's happening, see what is publishing, and so kind of, you know, get ideas and be less shy. So especially, I guess I'm looking at Malcolm here, and in terms of education conference, more like less specialized in economics education, but also Steve and KimMarie, if you know more about it, that would be great.
Well, there's loads of them. If you're just thinking in terms of education in the UK, there's the BERA conference every year, or higher education, there's the SRHE conference. Then there are European equivalents, EAIR, EERA, American equivalents, ASH, EAIR. I can't remember all the initials, but you know, there are several conferences on every continent every year related to education or higher education, some of them very specific, some of them very general, and they would certainly welcome people coming from economics, doing economics education, pieces of research coming along and talking at their conferences. I don't see why not.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Of course, Forgot Teach Econ Conference happening every year, online conference, completely free. So please, everybody join. And not sure, KimMarie, Steve, you want to add anything to, or anything that you want to tell us about the conference or the C3 conference?
So, I mean, first of all, I mean, I said earlier, I think it's really important that we as economics educators actually think about how we fit within the general landscape of education. I mean, a really good start to being able to be aware of where we sit within the literature is doing things like applying for fellowship of the Higher Education Academy, and actually making sure that you are embedding yourself in the literature from a very early stage of your career. But very, very much it's an important element if you're going to be thinking about publishing in scholarship of teaching and learning, to think, well, what is it that the other disciplines can bring us? I mean, the entire area of flipped learning in economics, we didn't invent flipped learning. People like Eric Mazur in the US were doing this tens of years before most of the economists started writing about this, and it's very much thinking, where do we stand? Reading more widely is just so key to being able to develop a good understanding. And if there are communities of colleagues working in scholarship of teaching and learning in your home institutions, I'd encourage getting reading groups within your department. I'd encourage reading groups beyond your department, so reading groups across the faculties or across the university, to be able to draw on each other's disciplines. What works in those disciplines might be transferable into our own.
Thank you, Steve. KimMarie, not sure if you want to add something.
I just want to promote C3 at the end of May. One of the reasons we designed it the way we did is we did want it to be servicing the education community in economics. So we don't just have research papers. We also have panels, we have keynote speakers, and we have workshops. So the workshops can be on enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, for example. So it's a very different kind of conference than your traditional economics conference, and that was purposefully designed. The program for this year is up on the AEA Committee on Econ Ed website, along with a bunch of other resources that support economic education.
Thank you very much, KimMarie. I'm quite looking forward to it. It's in Portland, so capital of beer. So really looking forward to that. There is a question from Carlos, and I guess it's mostly for Steve and KimMarie, and says, can I ask if you could explain a bit more what constitutes economics education? So most papers seem to present studies, data on economic principles, but are studies that involve the learning and teaching of, say, math, stats, or econometrics, and also economics education?
We've published articles on econometrics, understanding how in two realms, understanding how pervasive it is as a requirement in the major in the US, and also the content typical of courses. We have also published different articles on how we enhance math skills of students. So those are certainly within the realm of the Journal of Econ Ed.
I mean, similarly, Irie, if you're teaching economics, we very much welcome papers related to subjects linked to economics. So maths and stats for economics is certainly something that we would want to see. And that might be how you go about teaching economists mathematics, how you embed the practice of economics into that maths and stats. It might be about particularly how you draw out particular econometrics ideas. It might even be thinking about the curriculum within econometrics. There is a reason why we see a lot of principles of economics research, though, and that is just because it is because it's often the largest unit that students study, because it's often the first unit that a lot of students study, and it's much easier to get traction with innovations and with looking at those courses, just simply because the numbers are so much larger. I mean, this is particularly in the US, but even in the UK, we do tend to have larger core economics units than the supporting maths, stats, and econometrics across our institutions. So that does make it more likely that you're going to get research in that area. Similarly, I'd love to see more research on things like flipping classrooms, for instance, in higher level units. So maybe in elective final year units, how does it work in an environmental economics unit compared with an education economics unit? Does it work in the same way? Does it work in the same way in a principles unit in the first year as it does with a final year unit? Those are sorts of really important questions, but are potentially less studied simply because the principles units are so much larger than some of the elective units that you get in subsequent years.
Yes, we are biased by sample sizes, and so we like large classes, and because it gives us large sample sizes. So I have also a question about, of course, we have focused here in teaching, in the typical teaching of economics within like the classroom, but what about those of us, or those of you who are actually teaching within university, for instance, teaching professionals, teaching MBAs, teaching these kind of things? Will be either in education or in economics education, things that you might be interested about, for instance, the difference on how it is teaching or assessing, let's say, normal students than assessing professional people or these kind of things. What do you think? Let's start with Malcolm this time.
Not sure what you're asking there.
So I guess it's, we also, not all of us, but there are sometimes that people teach so MBA, so people that are not typical students within a university, professionals, you do short courses for professionals outside university that perhaps they are not looking for a typical degree in economics or just a typical degree in general, but you are looking for just getting some knowledge. And would that be part of interesting for your journals?
Yes, yes. Anything related to assessment and evaluation in any part of higher education. So yes, we get lots of stuff about postgraduate professional courses. We get lots of stuff about doctoral provision.
Great. KimMarie, Steve?
So I'd jump in and say, I mean, absolutely yes. Again, I mean, there's a growing number of not just education for professionals, but also the professional apprenticeships, and being able to understand what the differences are across those constituencies might be a really interesting question. It might be really interesting to think about, well, do particular methods work with different groups? Is there a different demand from the different groups in terms of how we teach, what we teach? I mean, there is an ongoing discussion about what should go into economics education for managers compared to economics education more generally. And all of these are really interesting questions, which I would very much welcome, with the usual provisos, as long as they're done well, as long as if we're evaluating an innovation, it's properly evaluated.
Thank you very much, Steve. KimMarie, do you want to add anything? Happy with that?
Yeah, I think we have slightly more limited scope because we absolutely encourage graduate economic education studies and reviews of those programs. But the MBA is a little bit harder. It has to be very specific on economic education rather than the MBA more broadly. But we have published master's level MBA kinds of papers in the past. It just has to be economic education at that level.
Thank you. I have more or less two more questions before, but one question, I want you to think, there is some questions about rejection, but instead of asking you individual questions, I want you to think more or less the last 10, 20 test rejections that you had. What were the main reasons for that? And if you find a theme or something.
Shall I kick in there? The ones that really stand out is, despite having sent it to a journal called Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, it's not about assessment or evaluation in higher education, it's about something else. Poor drafting, such that I try and read the abstract. If I can't understand the abstract, it's gone, it's rejected. And lack of engagement with the journal. It is surprising the proportion of people who write to a journal, send an article, yet they don't appear to have ever read that journal. Or if they have, they haven't found anything in it worth referencing. I mean, that's just an insult.
Thank you, Malcolm. KimMarie?
I would say I echo all of Malcolm's comments, and more specifically, if I can't discern the contribution, if there's not a clear statement of the contribution, that's an easy desk rejection as well. It's not just, I like to do this. This is what I'm adding to the economic education community.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo everything that's been said. We do go a little bit further sometimes in terms of desk rejections, in terms of if we see something that is just unlikely to gain any positive reviews, then we might reject a paper. Sometimes we'll. I mean, there was a question in the chat on Zoom about whether rejects are always permanent, final rejects, or whether sometimes they can reject and resubmit. Sometimes we will see submissions which are interesting but carried out really not very well, and or there might be a problem with them, or they might just need refocusing simply because we don't feel that it will be likely to gain good reviews, and under those circumstances we might reject and then invite a resubmission later down the line. But the typical things that we see rejections for in a desk rejection are being out of scope, we see an awful lot of submissions for things like high school education or for education of other subjects, or even the economics of education. So this is one of the areas that we get the most problematic submissions, because there is sometimes a very fine line between what is the education of economics and what is the economics of education. And that tends to be the main thing that stops things being even sent out for review.
Thank you, Steve. So I guess kind of well, there are a few more, but getting towards the end, something that's come out, what about new trends in publication? So of course, there are going to be things on assessment. I bet there are going to be a lot of GPT and artificial intelligence and how to use or avoid the use of these, and how you are going to be able to kind of evaluate these papers that are going to be kind of very new at this stage, because the whole technology is very new. But also kind of thinking about something that has been in the public quite a lot is about mental health. And there's a lot of us that, in addition to our roles, we have a lot of pastoral support roles. We have developed a lot of kind of, interventions to support student mental health. And would that be also part of, could be potentially part of the publication, or do you think that is not part of your journals?
Right, shall I start? In terms of, as long as it is within the scope of the journal, then it's something that is of interest. If we're thinking about how economic students are being affected in terms of their mental health by economics education, that may be something that could gain traction with the journal. If it's psychology students, then no. But it's as long as it's within the scope. I mean, in terms of new fields that are interesting, we've just had a whole run of education through COVID. I'm absolutely sure that we'll start to get a run of papers talking about how we can redesign assessment through ChatGPT and other forms of AI. We'll have a run of papers talking about how we deal with the post-COVID generation. The students who, that is the students who are coming into undergraduate education having had the high school education disrupted by COVID. So these are the sorts of themes that we're probably going to see. I wouldn't be surprised if we see ongoing discussions about the overall curriculum within economics as well.
I would suggest a couple of trends that we would like to see show up in all the education journals is enhancing diversity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and what you can do in and out of the classroom. So there's a couple of articles that are underway in the US about what are the different ancillaries you can do, the clubs, all of the different things you can do to build a community that allows students, and this is a mental health connection, but it's not a mental health focus. So for us, we are welcoming of mental health kind of articles, but they have to be connected through something that, again, is within the scope of our journal. But these ancillaries and building community and all of these stories, and just understanding what the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging landscape looks like for our students. There's a couple of studies that have done surveys, but they're isolated institutions. They are a particular class. We don't know what it looks like, let alone how to enhance that community. That is a trend that we are very much looking forward to receiving articles on.
Thank you,
We don't
KimMarie.
have much on student mental health because it would have to be linked to assessment or evaluation. What we do get is quite a bit about emotional responses to assessment or evaluation. That's quite a growing area of interest. We've had some stuff about ChatGPT, how that might be used to cheat, basically, but we haven't done any good stuff about it yet. So nothing that's going to publication yet. One area I would welcome more material in is innovations that don't work. You know, 99.9% of the time, you only read about things that worked. You know, people don't want to tell you they tried this and they tried so hard, but it didn't work. It was terrible. It was a complete failure. I think that would be very interesting. You know, people need to be told what not to try as well as what to try.
It's a very good point, Malcolm. And I rarely see journals actually embracing this kind of like, you know, publish negative results. We know that there is a bias towards publishing positive results. So I really, really appreciate that. And I think we just, because there are very, very quick questions about perhaps the organization of the journals. First, are decisions blind, or do you see the authors' names, especially when you send it to revision? And second, do editorial boards have non-academic practitioner employers, advisors, reps in the board?
I'll start us off. There is a level of blind in our review process, but it's not at the editor and the associate editor level. It's at the referee level. But honestly, in today's world of everything being online, if a referee wants to find the paper, they could. We encourage them not to, so that we can keep that blind component. But we do not have any non-academic practitioners on our editorial board.
Thank you, KimMarie. Malcolm?
Same for us. We try and keep it blind for referees, double blind. We don't have, well, we don't really have a very big board anyway.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's the same story, and in a way that's one the editors can see the names of the authors when they're making a decision, which in a way is why a desk rejection has to be relatively high or low bar, depending on your perspective, in order to make that decision. I am always very keen to send stuff out for review if I think there is any chance of getting considered for publication, because I don't want any biases slipping in terms of what we look at. But yeah, the reviewers should not be able to see who the author is. There is certainly in the papers I see, quite often those papers aren't yet in working paper series, particularly from those who are submitting who are teaching focused. So it is sometimes harder to find the paper than maybe it is for G submissions. But yeah, also I'm not aware of us having practitioners in our advisory board, but it's certainly an interesting and a good suggestion.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you very much, of course, to our panel for answering all our questions, and some like more weird than others. Thank you very much to the people here attending, because I know it's like a week before Easter or something, so getting towards our relaxed time. I just want to invite you all to join the various conferences, the various places, as I mentioned a few of them before, but next week we have the Royal Economic Society conference. There's going to be one session on education and training. I think Steve is going to be there. We have a session on diversity, and leading one of the sessions on diversity in the UK, but also we have the C3 conference coming up, the D conference coming up, the CTaLE conference coming up. So I really hope to see you all there. And other than that, have a good rest of the day, a good rest of the afternoon or the morning, wherever you are. And I'll see you at our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.